So I've had many people reach out and ask if I could do a Govee versus Fancyleds comparison video. Now essentially, these two products do the same thing, but after watching this video, I think you might come away surprised at just how different these two kits are. I'll be going over the strengths and weaknesses of each product as well as crowning a champion at the end. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Starting with Govee, I have their 55 to 65 inch version, but it's also available in 75 to 85 inch sizes. This new HDMI 2.1 sync box supports 8K at 60Hz, 4K at up to 144, as well as support for HDR, VRR, ALLM, and CEC. You get 4 HDMI 2.1 slots for all your streaming or gaming devices. As for the lights, it has 75 LEDs per meter and offers a dedicated white LED to go along with all the RGB colors. This LED strip is not cuttable and comes in predetermined lengths, and more on this later. Moving on to Fancyleds, I have their 56 to 65 inch kit, but they offer a larger one for 75 to 90 inch screens as well. Their version also supports 8K at 60Hz, 4K at up to 144, as well as support for HDR, VRR, ALLM, and CEC. With theirs, you have 3 HDMI 2.1 slots for your streaming or gaming devices, which is one less than what you'd get with the Govee setup. As for the lights, this is the first major difference between these two products. Fancyleds went with a strip that has 96 LEDs per meter compared to the 75 that Govee has, and Fancy lets you cut yours to the exact size needed. I'll go over how this plays out later on. So here I have both LED strips lined up next to each other, and if you're more of a visual person, I hope this example helps you understand why the difference in LED density is a big deal. Each of these colors of paper is going to represent a color that might be displayed on your screen. Both Govee and Fancy are able to control the LEDs in groups of 3. In this example, the 3 LEDs for Fancy lines up perfectly with the red, so all 3 of the LEDs would be turned to red. Now for Govee, since their LED strip is not as dense, 2 of their LEDs are in the red, but the third is on green. This is a fairly simple decision. Since the majority of LEDs are in red, Govee would have all 3 of their LEDs also be red. For green, this plays out very similar. Govee would still have 2 of their 3 controllable LEDs in green, so they would again put all 3 to green. Blue, however, is when it gets interesting, because the majority of this next group of LEDs for Govee would actually be in the yellow section. So what do you do for this situation? Do you altogether skip blue and put them to yellow since that's where the majority of the LEDs are, or do you put the LEDs to blue even though the majority of the screen is yellow? Hopefully this visual makes sense as to why higher density LED strips are able to offer greater accuracy when it comes to matching the colors simply because they have more controllable zones throughout the strip. Now before moving on, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Aura. So this is me signing up for their free 14-day trial, and during the setup process, one of the many things they do is scan the internet for data brokers that have your personal information. These data brokers then make a fortune selling your information to spammers, scammers, and other entities that want to know more about you. Now, Aura was able to find 30 such instances of my personal information being in the hands of these companies. Then, with one click, Aura sends out a notice to have my information removed from their systems, which they are legally required to do when asked. Their all-in-one platform offers antivirus protection, credit monitoring, credit lock, financial transaction alerts, secure VPN, identity protection, parental controls, 24/7 US-based customer service, and much, much more. I'll leave a link in the description for you to start your own free 14-day trial, so please make sure to check them out. Thank you all so much, and now back to the video. Getting these installed on your TV is where, again, you'll notice completely different approaches. Starting with Govee, like I mentioned earlier, has predetermined lengths. This is both good and bad. It's good because it's very easy to install and very simple to make the corners, but since this version has to be able to fit TVs between 55 and 65 inches, it's far too short to give me coverage to the corners on my 65-inch Sony Bravia 8, and I'm left with some pretty good gaps. I could move the strips in closer to the center, but having the lights closer to the edge in general is best for Ambilight kits. This won't be as noticeable on 55-inch TVs, but something to consider if you do have a 65-inch. Fancyleds, on the other hand, gives you an entire roll of lights that you can cut down to the exact size you need. This means I can have complete coverage around the entire perimeter of my screen. They include some tracks that will help guide the strips around the corners. This does take a little bit more time to install than the Govee kit, but I'm excited to see if there is a noticeable difference in colors around the corners since there is a drastic difference in coverage. Here I have both of these kits installed and lined up next to each other so you can get a better idea of how the lights look on the back. And in case you're wondering, this is not some editing trick. I went out and bought another 65-inch Sony Bravia 8 TV so that everything would be the exact same and that the results would be as fair as possible. What I ended up doing was filming for about 30 minutes with one of the TVs. I would then unplug everything from the back, remove it from the mount, grab the other TV that had the other Ambilight kit on it, and throw it up on the mount. I would plug back in the exact same cables, I would make sure it was level, Put the TV exactly 5 inches away from the wall on both sides, and then finally I would swap the same cords from one sync box to the other. And for my HDMI devices, I'll be using my NVIDIA Shield Pro and PS5. Most importantly, I would do this all in one recording session so that the camera settings remain the exact same while testing both kits. I did have to do one thing with the Govee setup to make this a fair fight. On dark parts of the screen, instead of turning the LEDs off, Govee had this dull light that would constantly be on. I think this takes away from the immersive experience, and the only way I could figure out how to correct this was to first turn the sensitivity up to what I imagined to be about 85%, and then I had to make sure brightness was set to anything other than 100. I'm not sure if this was done intentionally, but if any of you out there have noticed this on yours, hopefully this will help like it did for me. For Fancy LEDs kit, you don't have to do anything to adjust for black levels since it automatically adjusts for darker parts of the screen. Now to keep things as even as possible for this video, on Fancy LEDs I'll have the brightness set to 100, diffusion mode at medium, speed of diffusion at 50%, and medium saturation. For Govee, brightness at 99%, saturation at 50, and sensitivity we do have to keep at about 85%, which is what I just went over. So I'm going to start things off with app features, and this is where Govee 100% takes home first place. If you envision wanting to use these lights for when the TV is off, you have hundreds of different scenes you can choose from, many of which you can further adjust the speed. The other main use case might be for music, and this does have sound react functionality, although it is pretty basic. It works as you'd expect, but doesn't have much customizable options.
Test. Check. Hello?
Moving on to Fancy LEDs, and they also have some scenes you can toggle through, although not nearly as many or customizable. But I will give them some credit because the ones that they do have are nice and smooth and for sure take advantage of the high density LED strip. And just like Govee, you do have some sound react options, which also, just like Govee, doesn't allow for much adjusting. Now, maybe this type of non-Ambilight functionality is important to you, maybe it's not, but for sure something to consider when making a decision.
Check.
Alright, so let's now talk about the main thing that people care about, and that's which one of these systems performs best when it comes to mirroring the colors and movements on your screen. I'll be going over a lot of examples of side-by-side footage like this to ultimately crown a champ in this category. I'm going to freeze it here to point out a couple things. Right off the bat, I noticed how Govee is having a very tough time in the corners. The Fancy LED system maintains a nice glowing circle throughout the transition, while Govee gets too spread out. And right here you'll see a green color that looks slightly ahead of where it should be compared to over here. Now, if you were only looking at the left screen, you might not even notice this, but since we have the benefit of comparing things side by side, we can easily see where some of these differences are. So this next example does a great job of highlighting just how dialed in Fancy LEDs is with their black level performance and color accuracy. I'll play this on loop a couple times so you can go back and forth to compare it while paying close attention to the top right of each screen. And in this shot, you can see how Govee just has one solid color across the darker sky, whereas Fancy has a more accurate blue and then a lighter color for where the clouds come into play. For this one, I think both kits do an incredible job of color accuracy, but unfortunately, as you'll see time and time again, Govee is really at a disadvantage due to the lack of complete coverage around the perimeter. If I pause it as the colors are at the corners, you can for sure see how much brighter things are on the Fancy LED side compared to Govee. This is further highlighted when I turn the TV off and just have a solid color all around. Not only does Fancy have more complete coverage, they're also overall brighter, which is another advantage of having a 96 LED per meter strip compared to the 75 that Govee uses. We already talked about the benefits of having a higher density LED strip, and this is a great shot that showcases just how crazy accurate Fancy is able to get with their greater control. And make sure to pay close attention to the leaves as they enter the scene at the top of each screen. Another interesting observation I made during all my testing is how Govee and Fancy take slightly different approaches in regards to what part of the screen the LEDs are trying to match. I'll pause it here to explain. Fancy LED captures the colors at the outermost parts of the screen, while if you look at Govee, it appears that they look at the colors that are a couple inches in from the perimeter. This is paused at the exact same spot, but it's interesting at how different the results are. I think it makes the most sense to capture the colors at the outermost parts since this looks the most accurate, but I also realize when played back at normal speed, it's hard to notice the subtle difference. Now, one thing that both of these systems do extremely well is their ability to handle even the fastest on-screen movements. This fight scene from One Punch Man does a great job at showcasing how far these types of setups have come. I'll keep playing this since it is fun to watch, but one thing I did notice is during this clip, the scenes that had more dull and muted colors, Govee and Fancy interpreted things slightly different. I'm still not sure if I prefer one over the other in this aspect, but it's interesting nonetheless. Next, we're going to talk about syncing other products. Fancyleds at the time of making this video offers a 96 LED per meter strip, LED panels, and a neon rope that you can sync up to your main box to further add to the immersion. I recently did a video where I set up 3 of their LED strips in my living room and the results were amazing. I'll leave a link in the description to that project in case it's something you want to take a closer look at, but it's great to see them coming out with some different products to pair up. However, when it comes to this functionality, Govee reigns supreme. The sheer number of different products that you can sync up using their DreamView movie functionality is truly incredible and one of the best things that they have going for them. I recently tested out their setup using some of their Strip Lights 2 Pro and some of their Christmas string lights to deck out our living room, and the results speak for themselves. I haven't yet made a dedicated video on this setup, but if it is something you'd be interested in seeing, please let me know and I can put something together. So for HDR content, both systems performed what I would consider to be equally as well. Colors were bright and saturated, and I couldn't tell much of a difference between the two in this area, other than the Govee having the darker spots around the corner. Here I have Lion King playing, which supports Dolby Vision, and as you can see, the performance is spot on with what you'd want for this type of animated content. Gaming is another big area, and on my current setup with the PS5 and the Sony Bravia 8, which supports up to 120Hz, both systems were able to deliver on advertised features. I'll do a couple quick examples of response time in case you're curious, and I personally didn't notice any difference between the two in this area. On Spider-Man, here you can see that it is running 4K at 120Hz with HDR and VRR enabled on Fancyled sync box. And switching over to Govee, again you're getting the same results. So to begin wrapping things up, I'll start out by saying I don't think you'd be disappointed with either one of these products. However, if you were purely looking for what option is the absolute best, with its black level performance, insane color accuracy on even the smallest of details, and complete LED coverage around the entire perimeter of the TV, that award has to go to Fancyleds. I'll play some more side-by-side footage from here on out, but I hope you enjoyed this comparison video and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I hope you have a blessed day.
Rain pours down on this lonely night, wishing for your love, reaching for your light. I carry the weight of all I couldn't do, knowing the best of me was meant for you. I now understand, love is just a game. Someone always loses, forever the same. Wandering alone, weary feet, I cry for you on these rain-soaked streets. I look to the sky.